This is, of course, our usual constitutional law class that we have every Monday this semester. But it is also our celebration, at least the first 10 minutes or so, our celebration of Constitution Day 2012, the 225th anniversary of the signing of the first 7 articles of our Constitution. So it's only appropriate for us to raise our glasses of Madeira wine, the favorite of the founders, provided by Ms. Napier-Burton. Thank you, Ms. Napier-Burton. And our toast will be to the Constitution of the United States, and especially to the 21st Amendment. Oh my, indeed. Puts hair on one's chest. Now we know why the founders were such manly men. 19% alcohol. Yes, it was. The favorite drink of Thomas Jefferson. Come on, there was only a little bit in your cups. You're not all off your game yet. Our discussion today, to which we're very happy to welcome our visitors from outside of the class, is, you enjoyed that, did you? Okay, that was pretty good stuff. Alrighty, tremendous. It is, after all, after 9 o'clock in the morning.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Our discussion today is a story of 3 men, 2 of them Romans, and 1 of them an American who was very much aware of the Romans and aware of the examples that they had set. It's often been said that there's an ongoing debate right now in 2012, extends back as long as the Constitution has been with us, a debate over how to interpret it, whether it is a text which should be read as a text, and plain meaning of the words should prevail over all other interpretations. And then there are those who talk about interpreting the Constitution as a living, breathing document, perhaps a bit more room for interpretation there on that end. I'm not going to resolve that debate today, and I'm not really even going to address that debate today. I'm simply going to say that it's indisputable that in one way, our Constitution is a living, breathing document. And that is, without people to implement it, without people to interpret it, without people to live it, and the values that it represents, the Constitution is nothing but a piece of paper. Lots of countries have constitutions. Many of them disregard what those constitutions say and the values that they embody. But the reason our Constitution is, to this day, considered to be the granddaddy of them all, the longest continuously operating constitution in history and the model for much of the world, is because in our society, in American society, we live our constitutional values. You, as future lawyers, will be in the vanguard of that. For your generation, you will live and revere and respect our constitutional values, or not. That's both a great privilege and a heavy responsibility. So as you undertake that responsibility, as you embrace that privilege, it's appropriate for us to think about the person who most embodied our constitutional values and who lived them every day in his public life. And his public life was virtually his entire life. And I'm speaking, of course, of George Washington. Now, George Washington is not often cited among the pantheon of great constitutional thinkers in our country. We're much more accustomed to talking about James Madison or George Mason or Oliver Ellsworth or a bunch of other people that are considered to have contributed directly to the thought and to the theory behind our Constitution. Even Jefferson, even though he wasn't there, he was in France in 1787. We'll talk about him. But we really talk about George Washington, and that's a great oversight on our part, because George Washington lived the Constitution. He was, of course, the commanding general of the Continental Army, and he later became our first president. But it's often been said that the greatest things he ever did, the 2 greatest things he ever did, was to resign, was to willingly give up power, both at the end of the American Revolution and after his second term as President of the United States. And we don't have time today to talk about both of those incidents in depth. So let's talk about the more obscure one. Let's talk about the one that perhaps you have never really heard about. Washington's surrender of his commission, his surrender of his sword to the Continental Congress, actually it was then the Confederation Congress, in the Maryland State House on December 23rd, 1783. The Revolutionary War was not technically finished then. It wouldn't be finished until the following year with the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, but Yorktown was now well behind us. It was very clear the British had evacuated most major American cities. There were still a few British troops out west, up in Canada, but by and large the British were gone. We were firmly in control. People finally started to realize that maybe we won this war. And so Washington traveled to Maryland, to Annapolis, Maryland, to the Maryland State House where the Confederation Congress was then meeting. Remember, we had no capital city yet. And so the Confederation Congress would simply move from place to place. It was at the Maryland State House. And at that meeting, he walked in and gave a very brief speech, which I will share with you now. Mr. President, he said, of course he's referring to the President of the Confederation Congress, the great events on which my resignation depended having at length taken place, I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country. Happy in the confirmation of our independence and sovereignty and pleased with the opportunity afforded the United States of becoming a respectable nation, I resign with satisfaction the appointment I accepted with diffidence. A diffidence in my abilities to accomplish so arduous a task, which however was superseded by a confidence in the rectitude of our cause, the support of the supreme power of the Union, and the patronage of heaven. The successful termination of the war has verified the more sanguine expectations, and my gratitude for the interposition of Providence and the assistance I have received from my countrymen increases with every review of the momentous contest. While I repeat my obligations to the Army in general, I should do injustice to my own feelings not to acknowledge in this place the peculiar services and distinguished merits of the gentlemen who have been attached to my person during the war. It was impossible. The choice of confidential officers to compose my family should have been more fortunate. Permit me, sir, to recommend in particular those who have continued in service to the present moment as worthy of the favorable notice and patronage of Congress. I consider it an indispensable duty to close that last solemn act, this last solemn act of my official life, by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection, commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have the superintendence of them to His holy keeping. Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life. Now, Washington was wrong. This was the beginning of a very short and soon-to-be interrupted retirement. But he was right in a much more fundamental sense. Right, moral, constitutional. Notice that last line. I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life. Washington at that moment commanded the greatest military force in North America. In fact, arguably the only real military force in North America. As we've discussed in this class, he'd actually been urged by many people, in fact some of his own officers at once threatened to take matters into their own hands, urged to become king, to march on Congress, to take what was promised to the Continental Army, to control the future course of the nation. He could have done it. He would have done it not only at the point of bayonets, but with enormous popular support. Remember, the colonies had only ceased to exist as colonies a few years before. This is 1783. What's that? 7 years since the Declaration was signed. Most people in the United States had grown up under a king. Having a king was normal to them, and many would have embraced Washington as king. Who would have stopped him? Who would have stopped him? And yet, he went back to his farm. And the comparison's often been made between Washington and one famous Roman. And I should mention that all of the founders, including Washington, were very, very much aware of Roman history, the history of the Republic and how the Republic ended. And so it was a very common and well understood comparison. He was compared to the Roman general and in fact dictator, Cincinnatus. This was from relatively early in Roman history. And the Roman Senate had a habit, that's too strong a word. It would occasionally appoint someone dictator of Rome for brief periods of time, typically 6 months, when there was some grave emergency. And there was a grave emergency, and they appointed a fellow named Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus had been was a patrician, that means he was of the upper classes of Rome, and had been heavily involved in the ongoing dispute between the patricians and the plebeians,